Animating our scene, we'll move on to the actual look and style of the animation, starting with the materials and shaders. Let me double click to make a new material. This is going to be our floor material. And throughout all of this, I should be looking through our camera. Let's double click that new material. Call it the road, actually, not the floor. This is going to be black, and in the reflectance, let's disable the default specular. We are just dealing with reflections here. So let's add a reflection legacy. The roughness I would turn down all the way to 0, and specular strength do the same. The reflection strength itself is just going to be 20. We can set the attenuation to additive, and the layers blending mode, if we were combining it with the one below, we would want to set this to add, but it makes no difference in this case. Let's apply this to the road cube, which I didn't name correctly yet, so let's do that. I can place this directly or apply it onto the object in the list over here, but essentially we're doing the same thing. I will make a copy of this, and I would just make one change, which is the reflection strength. I'm going to turn down to just 10%. And this will be applied to the floor, which, if you recall, was the larger grid pattern just on the outside here. And once again, if I can just aim for it and place it down, you see it works. Or I can find it in the object list and do the same thing over there. And at this point, maybe I should enable my interactive renderer so that I can see the changes as I make them live. This is enabled by pressing the Alt key and R. And if I just expand its reach, make it a bit wider perhaps, and I will also move the quality slider all the way to the top. So now any changes I make, I can actually see what they look like in the final render itself. Right now I can see that the default light in Cinema 4D is turned on. That's why we can see anything at all. So to counter that, I am going to create a new light and just give this an intensity of 0. And that overrides any default lights which Cinema 4D tries to throw in by default. Anyway, we can continue. The next material I want to create is the one on the landscape itself. So once again, I will just make a copy of one of these materials. And in the reflectance, let's maybe push this up to about 50. Also in the luminance channel, I'm going to enable this, which is going to just make everything brighter. Okay, I haven't applied it yet, so that's why it's not making any difference. Let's call it landscape, and let's apply it to the landscape object. And anything we are doing in this first section and instance will be automatically updated in our other instances down the stretch here. So let's go to that material. Instead of just having a full-on white color, let's use a Fresnel effect. So that's found under texture and Fresnel. And what this does is it illuminates the different parts of our geometry based on the angle that the camera is looking at them. So if it's a steeper angle, you see it's brighter. But if we are facing it at more of a 90-degree angle, you see that it gets darker. And anyway, it creates this really nice looking effect. What we want to do though is jump in here, click the gradient, and let's just pull it back a touch, maybe to about halfway. Move the effect closer to the edges of our geometry, and then I'm going to change the color to about 265 on the hue slider, and then put this all the way up to 100% for the saturation. So this kind of blue/purple. It's too strong though, so let's go back to this level, and we can set the brightness to, let's say, 50. But it's being overlaid on top of white, so let's put the original white brightness down to 0, and we end up with something like this instead. And hopefully as we create more and more of these materials, you can start to see how this is going to shape up for the final look and style. Let's see what we can do next. We have these illuminated lines. So for these, we will create another material. Let's just double click anywhere. And in luminance, let's start with the yellow lines. So for the hue, that's going to be about 40 to 45. And saturation all the way up. Let's turn off any other channels. We just need the luminance channel for this one. And let's find those lines. So that's the side and center lines, which I will just drop in like this. It's also the grid lines on the floor, which I have currently disabled to speed up the performance of the scene, but we know that everything is going to work anyway because we have previewed our animation already. So we can turn those atom array lines back on. Let's apply the materials onto them. So the floor one is right here. This is going to be atom array floor. And the other one is atom array landscape. So if I click away and just give this a few seconds to process, we should see the lines on the floor there. So let's make a copy of this material and give it this kind of color, about 290 on the hue slider. And this is going to be the grid lines over the landscape. So that's the other atom array. And slowly it's starting to shape up. Next up, we have the trees, and I gave them a similar treatment to the landscape objects where we have the Fresnel effect. So if I copy the landscape material, and let's call this trees, except I'm going to remove any reflection, the Fresnel is going to be a different color. So if I jump in here, let's make this more of that 290 degrees or so for the hue slider. I will apply this onto the cloner, which contains all of the palm trees. And as soon as I do this, you will see that shading now kick in. That's it for the main materials. We do need to create the stars now that we see in the background. So for this, if I double click to create a new material, let's call this BG for background. And once again, in the luminance channel, I will disable the other channels. Let's enable luminance. If I just click this bar, this will open up the import dialog for our image. And I have this JPEG here, which just contains these stars. So we can bring this in, click no. We need to attach it to a plane and place that plane behind our sun. So if I press Alt and R, we can get a plane. And it needs to have the same ratio or dimensions as our image so that our stars don't get stretched out in either the up or sideways direction. So the orientation, first of all, needs to be Z+, so it's facing up. And then if we click on our material, I can see the resolution. This is if I click on the luminance channel, I can see the resolution is set to 4007 by 2505. So what I will do is start by giving my plane those same dimensions. So 4007 and then 2005. So that's 4 here, not 2. And if I apply that to the plane, which I will call background, let's move it past where our sun is. So that's at 80,000. Let's move this to 81,000 centimeters. And now it's somewhere way behind there. It needs to be much larger. And what I can do is the size, if I change the size here on editable objects, it automatically and proportionally changes the other size too. So if I go for, let's say, 100,000 centimeters for its X size and hit enter, you see that the Y size is automatically adjusted too. This only works down here, but you can always change them individually without affecting the other in the actual object properties too. That's clearly not large enough still. So let's change that to be, let's say, 120,000. or maybe even 125,000, basically until it's large enough to contain the entire frame. So we need to be on the first frame to line this up, and actually I think it needs to be even larger. So I've gone 440,000 here, and then here it also needs to be inside of the move null object so that it moves at the same rate as our camera and car. That way it will appear static in the distance, just like we did for the sun. Now, the material itself looks very fuzzy there. We can't really see any of the stars at all. So if we go to the editor in the material, let's change the texture preview size from default to, let's say, 2K, and we can now see the stars a bit clearer. Also, I know this image is upside down because of the orientation. It should be Z-. If we once again enable our interactive render, let's see what it looks like with the stars. In the example, the sky has a bit of a gradient to it, and also, a lot of color. Right now it's just completely black. So let's go into the material, and in the luminance channel, let's take everything and place it inside of a layer. So that's just going to this arrow, this drop down layer, and we can open this up, go into the shaders, and let's enable a gradient shader. Let's go to the type, set this to 2DV, so it goes up and down instead of sideways. And if we create 3 handles, the first one being this kind of color here, about 290 again, basically using the same colors throughout for some consistency to the style. And then the third handle is going to be the other color, which was about 265 or so. So I think this is upside down. I should be seeing from the halfway point the transition from this color to the other color, which would go from about here to the top of the frame. So I know this is happening because the plane itself is upside down. I would change the orientation from Z+ to Z-. And in the preview, you can already see that it's going to be the correct way. I could have just rearranged the way I did these colors here, but either way, we end up where we want. Let me right click and distribute, just to make sure that's right in the center. And then if I go back, place this gradient below my stars image, this bitmap, we want to set the stars blending mode from normal to, let's say, screen, and that will combine those two things together. You can now see the stars through the gradient. This needs to be a lot weaker. Let's go for about 25%. Right now it's too bright, about there. And I want to tone my stars a warmer color. Right now they are more of a white, cold color. Right click this bitmap image. I can place it inside of a filter. And if we jump in here, let's colorize this. Set the hue color to about 40 degrees, which is roughly like an orange/yellow color. And put the saturation all the way up to 100%. There is a preview here, but it's very small. You could open this up and right-click Open Window, enlarge this, and you can see the changes you do to the image in the filter. But it's almost like re-rendering this each time you make any changes. So you would just have to give it a few seconds to process before you see any difference. Anyway, we can see the differences in the actual image itself. If I go back, I can maybe change the blending mode from screen to add. This should make it brighter. And if the stars are not bright enough for my liking, I can copy this shader, go to shader and paste, and then add this on top of the original also. And this should create a brighter stars effect. It's very subtle, and it might get lost in the quality of the video you're watching, but that was just a bit punchier than before. But that's it as far as the materials we have to create. From this point, I am just going to make some changes to the existing materials. Starting with the sun, it's simply not bright enough. So if I go to its material, that gradient we created earlier, To change its brightness, I have to go to the luminance channel, and the brightness here, if I go for, let's say, 150, you don't see any change at all yet. That's because the mix mode with our gradient should be set to multiply. And now, when I make this brighter up here, you will see a difference, and it actually updated by itself there. I will leave that there for now. We can actually adjust these colors later in After Effects anyway. Another change I will make is the material on the windows. Currently I can see through it, which I don't really like that much. I prefer this kind of dark tinted look. So I will go to the car's materials, which are in this DMC12 layer, and it's this glass material here. So we're just gonna turn off the transparency, and then in reflectance we could maybe put a slight shiny effect to that. So that's just a classic reflectance layer. Set this to add, and roughness set all the way down to 0. Same for the specular strength, and the reflection strength I will put down to about 50. Attenuation, additive, and the layer color I will throw in a Fresnel to create this kind of material. This should have the effect of just completely blacking out that window, and I like that for this particular scene. Another adjustment, you can see right now my car's white paint material is completely invisible. That's because there are no lights in the scene, or we do have a light, but if you recall, I set its intensity down to 0. So let's get another light, and this one I will set to about 25, maybe 20, and I will enable this ambient illumination switch, which applies the same level of illumination to all of the objects in the scene. And since the car's paint here is one of the few materials that has a diffuse channel in the color channel, that's where you really only see a difference. Everything else is being made up of luminescence and reflections, so it doesn't really affect much else. But now we can see the paint on our car. Furthermore, if I go to the color, let's give it that same color that we've been using up to this point, but with a saturation of only about 40% or so, just so that it's not completely white. We want to give that a slight tint to blend in with the rest of the scene, and as I do that, you see the slight change there. Okay, but that's it. That's how we create the materials and colors for our scene here. One final thing is I will point out that the lights on the back of the car here, of course, that's this red material that you see, which is just a simple red color in the luminance channel. It already came pre-applied onto the car model. And if I just show you what that looks like, let me disable this interactive render and solo the car by itself. It's on the lights at the back here. If I open this up, this piece of geometry right there, and I just isolated the color to be on the actual tail lights. I think these are the brake lights here, and you've got your indicators, your reverse lights, and so on. So the middle strip here is where I applied this backlight material. If I solo just that piece of geometry, you can see how this works. I simply selected those polygons. So if I press U and F, I can select any polygons which are connected together. And I'm holding Shift to make a multiple selection. And we'll do that over here. And if I were to just quickly create a new material as a test, I can enable luminance on that. Okay, they're over here, and apply it to there. And you can see it applies to only those polygons I selected. Now, I think I had the other one selected prior to that, so it went there too. But just in case you were wondering, that's how I ended up with just that part of my rear lights illuminated. And that's what we want for this scene. So the materials and shaders are just the first step in developing the style and look of our animation. In the next lesson, we'll continue with this. Continuing to develop the style of our animation, we are now going to create a fog effect, and this is going to give us some depth and dimension and atmosphere to our animation. This is where we left off in the previous lesson, and once again I will enable my interactive render region by pressing Alt and R on the keyboard, so we can see the changes as I do them. Now we want to do our fog effect, and this is going to start with the physical sky. Let's just bring that in, and we need to disable the sky and sun in here and just keep the fog turned on, and that's it. And then in the fog itself, and by the way, those switches were in the basic tab, but the controls of the fog are in the fog tab at the end here. And I will go with a color that we have been using up to this point, about 292 degrees on the hue, and then maximum saturation and brightness, and you will see the change immediately. Then I will go to the height and set this to negative 2500, just to start further below the ground level. And the end height I will set to about positive 3500. Now this is going to be completely too much fog, so let's dial it back, and that's going to be in the density here. Let's go for 12.5 instead. And when I do that, we pretty much have our entire fog setup for this. That's all we need to do. Of course, here you could use different settings if you wish. You could make this more intense by increasing this density if you wish, or changing the start and end height. I'm going to render this single frame to the picture viewer. So in my render settings, I have unticked save because we just want to preview this in Cinema 4D, because I want to show you a problem which will occur anytime you use fog in Cinema 4D. It's a bug which has been present in basically all versions of Cinema 4D up until now, but it's very easy to fix. You just need to be aware of it. So if I close this project and then reopen it, so if I go to recent files, and it's that one at the top, and without doing anything different and just hitting render to picture viewer once again, you will see that the fog is not rendering correctly. At a glance, it might seem like everything is fine, but if I go back to the original, you can see here the fog is how we want it, and then here it seems to only render behind all the objects in the scene, and we've got nothing closer to the camera here. So this just happens because the fog effect in Cinema 4D does not reinitialize when you open and close a project, or when you close and open a project, rather. You have to change one of these values, and then it will render correctly and reset to where it should be, as you see there. So to fix this issue, you just need to attach a keyframe to any one of these values at the beginning of your animation, so that the next time you open this, or maybe you send it to someone else, to render or something like that, the keyframe will force Cinema 4D to reinitialize the fog correctly from the beginning. So if I, let's say, do this on the start height, I will just drop it down to negative 2499, set a keyframe at frame 0, move forward one frame, and then set it back to what it should be, which is negative 2500. The whole point here is that between frame 0 and 1, I have made a change to the value. And that's it. The next time I open this project, it's going to always render correctly. Now, I may still lose the first frame because it only reinitializes after it detects the keyframe. But because this is a loop, and because of the way we have set this up, the first frame of our animation is actually identical to the last frame of our animation. So if you lined up those clips back to back, you would always be repeating where those two frames meet. So we actually always need to take out the first frame or the last frame from the animation anyway. So it's not a big problem if we lose the first frame, because we are always going to cut it out anyway from the final animation. So that's it, just a weird quirk in Cinema 4D that's been there for several versions. But if you encounter this problem, which you will, now you know how to fix it. Okay, and that's how we do the fog effect in Cinema 4D. Just a few steps, and also just be aware of the glitch which will occur. Anyway, in the following lesson, we are going to start refining our render and getting ready for the output. In this lesson, we are going to refine our settings with two goals in mind. One is we want our animation to look as clean as possible. And secondly, we want it to output the whole animation as fast as possible too. So let's see what those settings are. The first quick change I would do is I'm going to point my camera slightly up. If I go to the camera and in the coordinates, let's set the rotation pitch up by 1 degree. Now that ends up revealing the top of this frame here. So this background, I'm going to move that up manually using my mouse, just to the point where it's no longer visible at the top there. Let's go to the render settings, and in output, I will go for 1920 by 1080. And I will just keep firing shots to the picture viewer to see where we are at each stage and what refinement we need to do next. Also, part of this is trying to get as fast a render as possible. So the first thing is that in general, some of these might look a bit rough. And for example, the reflections of the palm trees onto the landscape object, that's just is going to look too messy in the final animation. So we need to exclude the palm trees to appear in these specific reflections. So the way to do this is if I go to the object that's casting the reflection, which is the palms here, let's right click, and under render tags in Cinema 4D R21, I think this was called compositing tags in older versions. Let's get the compositing tag itself, and we want to go to the exclusion tab, and let's drop the landscape here. So this whole object is now going to exclude the landscape object when we render it out. So if we send that to render, as soon as this starts to reveal, we will see that change has occurred. So this is before. I want you to watch these two main areas where you can see the reflection of the palm, and now it is completely gone. This also works to stop the palm trees from occluding or from obstructing the reflection from the sun onto the landscapes here. It just looks a bit cleaner, and I prefer this to what we had before. Let's see what we can do. Because of where the car is, I don't really think I'm going to see much of a reflection from the palms off of the car. So I may as well just remove the car from this equation too, which is just, drag the whole thing here. And now this will no longer bounce off the car either. And I noticed that the palm trees themselves look a bit too dark. So I'm going to increase the strength of the luminance, which I had turned down to 50% before. And also maybe just extend the reach of this Fresnel effect. And let's also output this, and we can already start to see the difference. So by extending the Fresnel just a touch, I have made the palm trees a bit more prominent, and I think that's a bit better. Also, by removing the palm trees from being reflected on the car, that has almost cut the render time by half. So before we were at 18 seconds for this result, now we are at 11 seconds. So that's an extra bonus there, and also a cleaner looking render. Another speed improvement we could try, let's see if this has any difference, In the options, we have some depth controls here. This just controls how many times, like for example, the reflection depth currently is set to 5. That means it's going to bounce around 5 times before it stops being rendered out. So if we cut this down to, let's say, 2, and for the ray and shadow depth, we actually don't have any real shadows in the scene. But if I had, I would maybe put this at about 6, and the same for the ray depth. The default values are generally overkill, and if you lower those, you can actually get a faster render time without really affecting what your image looks like. And the whole point is just find where that number is and see if it can improve anything for you. In our case, I didn't really get any extra speed because it's a fairly simple scene, and like I said, there wasn't any shadows to cut out anyway, and any reflections which are there very simple. But you would have seen different results in different projects perhaps. One final change I could do here is make the sun itself brighter, because all of that fog actually made it appear a bit dimmer. So if I go to the brightness, I would just go all the way up to 200% this time. And once again, make sure that the mix mode with the gradient is set to multiply. Otherwise, you won't see any change here. And then in the anti-aliasing settings, this will control how smoothly pixels are rendered out. And by default, it's just set to this geometry control. Let's change it to best, and we'll go for a minimum level of 1 by 1, max level 2 by 2, and I will go for a threshold of 5%. And this should give us a slightly smoother looking image without increasing our render time too much. And even if it does, we don't really have that many frames to output anyway. At 24 FPS, there's only going to be about 200 frames total. So the whole thing can still render in a reasonable amount of time. But let's just preview this one more time. And this is what I'll move on with to do the final output and set up our export. So let this finish through. We can quickly compare to the previous frame. We've now got the brighter sun out there in the distance. And in some areas, the pixels are visibly just a bit better looking because of the anti-aliasing. Now, some of this will get lost in the streaming quality of Skillshare. At 17 seconds a frame, that's still a very reasonable render time. I think for me, the whole thing would have taken about 2 hours or so, which wasn't bad at all. That's on a CPU which is nearly 7 years old at this point. It's an Intel 3930K. It's a very old computer, but still very capable of producing some images like this. So there you have it. By changing a few settings and applying a few tags here and there, we were able to clean up our image and also make sure that the render times are reasonable. In the following lesson, we will look at the actual output from Cinema 4D. This is the final lesson in Cinema 4D. We are going to output our frames using an advanced method where each frame is going to be broken down into different layers, and this is going to give us more control later when we get to the After Effects section. So this is how the final export is going to work. If I go to my render settings, in the Save tab, let's start there. This is where we define the format for our output. And my favorite by far is PNG sequence, and it's always in the 16-bit channel because there's just way more information in the frames that way. I can specify an output path, and you can see I've already done this before. So let's create some new folders. One is going to be called main number 2, and let's just jump in here. Call this main. Okay, so this is where my main render would go to. Just another note before I continue with this. If I press Ctrl and D to open up my project preferences, this entire time I've been working in a 30 FPS, 30 frames per second. Now, I really should have been at 24, but it doesn't really matter. You can simply just punch that in and the whole project will conform to the new FPS. Anyway, this is important because we want that to match our output FPS also. So in the output settings, which is defaulted to 30 here, I'm gonna make that 24 here. The frame range is going to be all of the frames. So, 8 seconds at 24 FPS gives us 192 frames, and that's what we have here. Okay, we could at this point just output this to the picture viewer, or maybe using the render queue, which I will get to shortly. But I want to output this project in a way that will give us more control later when we get to the After Effects section. So by that I mean I want to break down the image into various layers that we can then blend together with much more control later. So let me show you what I mean. We want to go to multipass, and if I open this up and let's say add ambient, and then I will also add reflection and diffuse. Let's make sure that multipass is also enabled here, and in the save tab we now have a new extra save path that we need to specify. This is for the multipass layers. If I turn this off, you see that disappears, and if I turn it back on, it reappears. This is also going to be in PNG. We just need to place this in a folder by itself. So this is going to be a new folder called multi, and I'll call it number 2 also. And in here, I will just call the file name multi. So all of these various layers will end up in that folder. Anyway, let's see what's so special about this. If I close the render settings for now, or before I do that, let's just not save anything. We're just throwing this to the picture viewer, and it will warn us that this is not being saved anywhere, but that's okay. You can see it has started the render and it's lined up all of the frames. We just need one to use as an example. If I go to the layer section, and we can currently see it's set to image, let's set this to single pass. And you can see these various layers which correspond to the multipass layers I set up a moment ago. And if I press escape here, I can stop this render from continuing. Let's just look at the one frame by itself. So you can see our final image is made up of these different layers together, and Cinema 4D just basically blends all of that into a single frame. But by separating it this way, it means that when we get to After Effects, we can control each layer individually, and that gives us way more control than we would if we were just using a single flat image like this. Anyway, once again, if you go to Layer and Single Pass, that's how you view these various layers together. So in addition to the 3 layers that we have so far that make up our image, there are other multipass layers you could have in other seeds perhaps, such as specular, but we don't have anything like that here, so it's not going to be part of our output. But we do have atmosphere effects, and this is going to contain the fog layer. So I would enable this. In other scenes, if I have things like shadows, I would also bring this in. So basically, you are just tailoring this to your specific scene. For our scene, we just need these 4 particular multipass layers. And in addition to that, I also want to be able to control different parts of the image individually if I want to. So for example, let's say we get to to After Effects, and I just want to change the color of the sun, for example, or the color of these grid lines. To do that, I need to output masks along with my regular image layers. And to do that in Cinema 4D, to output black and white masks, we have to use what's called the object buffer system in Cinema 4D. So let's pick an object that we want to isolate. Let's say the whole car itself. If I go to the car model and right click, go to render tags, which again is compositing tags in older versions of Cinema. If we go to render tags, I want to go to compositing, and we have a tab here called object buffer. So let me enable this, and this is in buffer number 1. And in the render settings, I am going to go to multipass and then get an object buffer. And this group ID in this buffer needs to correspond to the object that I am trying to output. So far it's just the car. If I output this once again, and let's do a single frame just to keep things simple for now. So this is in the output. Let's go to current frame. And as this renders through, if I scroll down my different single passes, we now have an extra one here called object buffer number 1. And you can see it's a black and white mask of just our car. So this would allow me then in After Effects to use this layer as a luma matte to control just the colors or anything else on just the car. So I want to go ahead and set this up for several other objects, but on the car itself, let's go to the geometry which controls or which holds the backlights, and I will insert another compositing tag. This is going to be in buffer number 2. And let me show you something else you need to be aware of. If I do another render, if we look at buffer number 1, you will see that the lights have disappeared. And that's because Cinema 4D processes these in an order. So it will always look at the object level first, and then look at the parent. So in the object level, we have removed the lights from buffer number 1. We just enabled number 2. So we need to make sure that it's in both number 1 combined with its parent, but then also it's just in number 2 by itself. I hope that makes sense. It should if I just insert number 2 here and then set the group ID to match that. One more render, and now we see both buffers appear. The first one contains everything that's in number 1, and then the second one is just the lights on their own. Okay, we can continue and set the rest of the other things up. So I'm gonna go for, let's say, the background object. This can be in a buffer by itself. Put this in number 3. And then for the main geometry, let's say the palm trees, they can be number 4. And basically anything that can be selected, I should set that up for it. I will combine the side and center lines, though we don't necessarily need those to be separate. There will be number 6, the road will be number 7. The array for the landscape, I will drop into 8. The landscape itself is going to be number 9. And we can also put the sun in an object buffer. So that's going to be the sun out there in the distance, and it's inside of this null over here. So if I just copy any of the tags onto it, I think we got up to number 10. Okay, no, we got up to number 9 down here, and then this can be number 10 for the final sun. And I think that should be everything. I will go back to my render settings and go and enable save. And let's enable all the frames, and I could render to the picture viewer like we have been doing up to this point, but I think it's better to line this up in the render queue instead. But before I do that, actually, I realized that I did not set up the remaining buffers. We just need to keep inserting these until we have the right number. It was about 10 in total. You can select all of them at once like this, and then just go through the different numbers and making sure that it goes through the same numbers that you set your buffers to. So we've got 7, 8, 9, and 10. And now I can send this to my render queue for the final output. So if I go to render and add to render queue, you can see I finished a render prior to this. This was the first version of the project. And this is what we have just created for our class. And here I would simply just go to jobs and start rendering, and it will start to output in the background. So you could do something like this and leave it running overnight perhaps, or maybe just step away from your computer whilst this is processing. It's obviously very CPU intensive, so you really won't be able to do much else whilst your render is going on in the background. And after it renders a few frames, it will estimate the overall time it's going to take to complete the entire animation. And all of our frames are roughly similar, how long it would take to do each one. So this is quite accurate. It's going to take about an hour and a half to render this entire animation, which isn't bad at all. And if I look in the final output folder, I can see the frames are writing to my disk. The first frame rendered incorrectly, if you recall, because of the fog glitch, but it's not a problem. We're going to take it out anyway. But from the second frame onward, you see everything looks correct. And in the multipass folder, we can see all the several multipass layers rendering into here all at the same time. So that's it. That's how the multipass system works in Cinema 4D, and you will see why this is so useful when we get to the following sections in After Effects. To begin with, in After Effects, we're going to take the frames from Cinema 4D, and this is very simple. It will take just a couple of minutes. This is our project in After Effects, and we have been looking at this reference throughout the project. We now want to take the renders we outputted from Cinema 4D and build them into what we see here. So if I go to the project window, I can just double click here to open up the location where my renders went to. So at this folder, I have the main render itself, which we can just use as reference, but the actual final image is going to be built by the various multipass layers that we outputted from Cinema. So let's go and get those. If I double click here once again and go to the multipass folder, you can see there are several types of multipasses in here, and all of them would have outputted to this one folder at once. So to import all of them, just simply select any frame, press Ctrl A to extend the selection to everything, and your computer might have to think about this for a second. But once this is done, you can tick this button here, which says multiple sequences. And if I import, After Effects is going to automatically detect the frame ranges of each particular sequence, and it will bring them all in as separate layers like this. I'm not sure how long this feature has been around, the multiple sequences import, but if you don't have it in your After Effects, you can still click any sequence, or any frame rather, from any of the sequences and bring them in one at a time. You just have to make sure that the sequence button here is ticked. And if you do that, it doesn't matter which frame from a sequence you select, it will still bring in the entire frame range. But obviously the quickest way is to select all of them at once and use the multiple sequences switch. If I click on any of my sequences, I can see that they are 24 FPS, but by default, After Effects is set to 30 FPS. So to make sure that your footage is the right frames per second, you want to right-click, Interpret Footage, and Main. And then in the main options, down here where it says Assume this frame rate, you want to type in 24. And then you can right-click, Interpret Footage, remember the interpretation, and you can select all the other frames or all the other sequences, Interpret Footage, and Apply. And just double check when you click on them and see what the FPS and duration is up here. It should be 24 FPS and 8 seconds. At this point, you may also want to just organize your project a bit better. So we can say, for example, these sequences, these are our main image sequences, right? And then all these other ones, we have the buffers. So we can drag them to a new folder, and let's call that buffers. In addition, it's also a good idea to name the object buffers or the masks here so that it's easy to identify in our project. You can double click each one and preview it in the window here, and you can tell what it is. So this is clearly the sky on the background. Just double click the next one. This would be the floor. Now, depending on what order you did yours in, all of these are going to be different. So just go through and try and name everything as much as possible. So after a couple of minutes, I have now renamed all of my buffers so I know what each layer contains, and this will make it much more organized when we start doing the compositing itself. Okay, now that we have all of our frames and layers in After Effects, we can move on and do the actual compositing. Continuing in After Effects, we are going to take the layers that we brought in from Cinema 4D and we're going to layer them together to build up our final image and then applying various effects on top of them. This is where we want to end up after our compositing in After Effects. There are several things to go through here, so let's just jump straight in. I am going to begin with the multi-ambient pass, and I will just drag this to a new composition button. And at this point, it's worth just going through our color management settings to make sure that everything stays consistent. Currently, this is using my display's color management. And even if I untick this, it stays the same. And then if I go to the project working space, I can see that this is set to this sRGB color profile. And for me, this is what my screen is calibrated to, so there is no change whether I set it here or use my display's color management in this section. But if I were to come back in here and use something like Adobe RGB, I will get a slightly different response. This particular profile tends to be a bit more muted and less saturated, and personally, I am not a big fan of that. So I tend to stick with my sRGB profile. So if you get to this stage and suddenly find your colors looking a bit odd, just make sure you are using the correct color profile there. And also the color depth should be set to 16 bits per channel so that we extract as much information from our renders, which, if you recall, were also outputted at 16 bits per channel from Cinema 4D, those various PNG sequences. So with our multi-ambient pass imported into this new composition, let's bring in the other layers that make up our final frame. So we have diffuse, and I will place this below the ambient layer. And on the ambient, let's set its blending mode from normal to screen so that we blend the two layers together. If this blending mode menu is not visible, just press F4 on your keyboard and it will cycle through. And you just need to do this once or twice. And now we have it there. Okay, moving on, we have the reflection layer. Let's bring that in and once again, screen it. And finally, we have the Atmos layer, which contains our fog. So very quickly, by just combining those four layers, we have reconstructed what our image looked like in Cinema 4D, except now, because these are four separate layers, we can control each one individually and make some adjustments. So for example, on the fog layer, I could go to the color correction in effects, and let's say hue and saturation, and here I could change the color of the fog. So let's say, just using the hue slider, we can go to the left or to the right, and that's going to change the tone and color of the fog. I'm just going to leave it as it is, but I just wanted to quickly illustrate the level of control we have now. I want to create a glow effect on the sun and several other elements in my frame. And for this, I am going to make use of the object buffers we outputted from Cinema 4D. Now, I actually accidentally did not export the buffer for the sun, so it's missing from this list. But luckily, I can take all of these, what we have, and put them to a new composition. And of course, if you have been following the class up until now, you won't have this issue because I outputted this correctly in the class, but this is the older project I am looking at here. Anyway, if I bring all of these into the new composition and it's a single composition, I can set all of their blending modes to be add, which means they will combine, and the only thing that's missing is the sun. So this will still be useful as a mask, I just need to invert how I use this. Anyway, let's go to the multi-ambient layer, which is our main composition. Maybe I should call it that. So in the composition settings, let's call this main and click OK. This new composition with the combined buffers, I am going to call sun mask, and let's bring it into our main composition. Take another copy of the ambient pass and place it below the sun mask, and then let's press F4 And we want to go to this ambient layer, and under track matte, let's point to the sun mask, except we're using the inverted matte instead. And if I solo this to appear on its own, you can see I have just now selected those pixels. So let's pre-compose these two together, and it's going to be called sun. Click OK. And if I bring it back and apply a glow effect, which is found under stylize and glow, we can put the threshold all the way up to 100, and the radius I will set to 50. And if this layer's blending mode was set to screen, it will blend on top of the original and just brighten everything up. But I also want to put a bit more color into this glow effect. So if I just set this back to normal for a second, I can go to Effect, Generate, and Gradient Ramp, and we are just coloring the sun. Let's put the glow effect below the gradient, and the start color is going to be the yellow/orange at about 40 degrees or so for the hue. And the end color will be that sort of pink-red color about here. And let's get the gradients handles and bring them closer to where the actual sun is. So something like this. And as I am doing this, we can see the glow changes color. And this is it without the gradient ramp and width. And let's set the blending mode to screen. And once again, this is with the gradient and without. I just prefer the tones that we have changed here in After Effects. So let's continue. I am going to do the tail lights. There is a glow effect I applied onto that, this kind of cross glow effect. Let's do that here too. And once again, I will make use of the ambient pass. And we have a mask we created for the rear lights. And it's just this right here. Place that above the ambient pass. And once again, Luma Matte. A Luma Matte, except this time it's just the regular Luma Matte because we outputted this mask correctly, or this object buffer. And if I solo this on its own, you can see it's just the rear lights. Let's pre-compose this and call it lights precomposed 1. And I want to go to Effect, Blur and Sharpen. We want directional blur. Set the direction to 35 degrees and the blur length to 80. Let's duplicate this and just reverse the directional blur on the new layer to -35. Let's pre-compose both of these layers together, and they're going to be called lights precomposed 2, like this. And I can set this layer's blending mode to screen so that it adds on top of the original. Go to Effect, Stylize, and Glow. I want to drop the threshold all the way down until I start to see some orange pixels start to appear. It creates this kind of hotter looking red glow. So about 10% for the threshold, anywhere between 8 to 10. And the radius I will set to 50, just to diffuse the whole effect a touch. The blending mode can also be set to, let's say, add, and this is going to just make it pop just a bit more. The next object I want to have glow are the lines on the outside of the road and the lines in the center as well. And for this, I have 2 separate buffers. For the class, we outputted them all at once, but it's basically the same thing. We have the side lines and the center lines. So I will drop these into a new composition. And once again, single, click OK. And just make sure the top layer is set to screen or add so that both will appear at the same time. Let's call this composition lines. And in the main comp, let's bring our ambient layer and the lines, configure the track mat just like this, and then pre-compose that layer. This is going to be lines pre-composed number 1. Go to Effect, Stylize, and Glow. Set the threshold to be lower, maybe all the way down to 0. And for the radius, let's say 50 to start with. However, for the glow itself, I want more of an orange tone. So instead of using the original colors, let's switch this to A and B colors. And then I can define what colors I want this to glow as. So for color A, let's do about 40 degrees on the hue slider and maximum saturation and brightness. Click OK. And for the B color, I will pick the one above and then just make it a bit more orange. Maybe about 25 degrees instead. Let's copy the glow effect, and on the new one, I would change it back to original colors because it will take the colors from the one above. We want to set the radius to 100 and then play with the threshold until we get something we like. I think about 60 is what I used in the original project, and this second effect just makes the effect a bit stronger and a bit more diffused. And then one more area I want to target using one of the buffers is the sky in the distance there and the stars. So once again, we will make use of the ambient pass and the buffer that I created for the sky. Place this above the ambient layer. Let's set up the track mat. If I solo the sky layer, it looks like this. And what I want to do is go to Effect, Generate, and Gradient Ramp. Let's turn off the gradient ramp effect so we can see the colors behind, and I want to choose those as my 2 starting colors in the same positions. If I re-enable the gradient, let's move the lower handle to be in the center. This is where the horizon line is, and this one can stay at the top there. I want to have this be about half as bright as it currently is. So for the start color, which is a brightness of 53%, I will drop this to just 25. And it ends up looking a bit too purple, so I will drop its hue to somewhere around 230 degrees perhaps. Click OK. And the end color, I will also just drop the brightness down to 25%. If I bring it back to reveal everything else, you can see the stars are missing, but the sky is indeed much darker. Too dark, but if we place it behind the Atmos layer, it brightens up a bit. It's just that the stars are missing. So to bring back the stars, I am going to make a copy of this layer, the sky with the gradient. Let's rename this one Stars and remove the gradient ramp. This will once again brighten everything because we are just back to where we started, but I can go to Effect, Color Correction, and Levels. And if I just create some contrast on that layer and let's solo it to see what's going on, it's going to get rid of all the colors and leave just the bright spots, and those are our stars. Let's bring everything else back and set this star layer to Add. And so by separating the stars from the background color, I was able to darken the whole sky behind the sun there. Furthermore, I can now deal with the stars on their own. I want to give them a similar glow effect to what we did on the tail lights. So if I duplicate the star layer, let's go to Effect, Blur and Sharpen, and Directional Blur. And at the top, let's just zoom in somewhere where we can see the direction is going to be, let's say, 40 degrees, and the same for the blur length. And it's going to give the stars this streaky blur effect. Let's duplicate this layer and just reverse the direction of the blur effect, so -40 instead. And now we have them going in the other direction. Let's combine these two layers, or maybe we don't have to because they just appear the same anyway. And if I just zoom out and turn these two on and off at the same time, we can see the glow effect we have on the stars. So if I do a quick preview by pressing the spacebar, this is what we have so far. It takes a few minutes to do a full preview just because we have so many layers being rendered out here. And for your own project, I encourage you to continue making further adjustments. You could create something that looks completely different in how it is styled, the colors, the various glow effects, and so on. Because you have all of these object buffers we outputted, you can target specific parts of the image and customize them to look like however you want. So play around with that and see what you can come up with. But anyway, in the next lesson, we'll look at doing some final color adjustments, as well as this old school VHS effect. This is the second main lesson in After Effects. We're going to do the VHS effect and then applying the final color adjustments. This is the final loop once again. Now we want to do the final color adjustments as well as this old school VHS effect. And this is made up of three main elements. We have, which is just some stock footage, these lines you see flashing up on the screen. The whole frame is shaking. We will do that with a wiggle expression in After Effects. And then we have an RGB split effect. So let's start with that. In the main composition, if I select everything, I am going to pre-compose. Let's call this main pre-composed 1. I will press Ctrl D to make a copy, go to Effect, Channel, and Shift Channels. And on this first one, we want to just leave the red channel enabled. So green and blue will be switched to full off. That just leaves the red channel. Let's make a copy of this layer once again. And this time we want green. And finally, let's switch off red and green and turn on blue. So we have split our image into the 3 different color channels. And now we want to add them back to each other. So just do this on the top 2 layers. And we are back to where we started. But because these are on 3 separate layers, I can go to the first layer, or the second one, which is holding the green. And let's set its scale, press S to bring this up, to 101. And by offsetting the scale, we can now start to see the RGB split effect. Let's do the same to the top layer, which is holding the blue color, and this will be set to 102. And now if we go to, this side of the frame, you can clearly see the 3 different colors that make up this RGB split effect. We've got red, green, and blue. This is too sharp though. I want to blur the whole effect. So if I go to each individual layer, I will apply a fast box blur and set the radius to just 2. And let's put this onto the one below and also the red. And now we have to take these 3 layers, pre-compose them, and call it RGB split. Click OK, and the mode will be set to color, the blending mode. So now this overlays on top of the original. If I turn it on and off, you can see the difference. The next thing is to make our frame shake. So if I take both of these and pre-compose them, let's call this main pre-composed number 2, and I will go to the position of this layer. So press P to bring that up. And I want to separate this into the 2 different dimensions. So X position and Y position. On the X position, I am going to hold the Alt key on my keyboard and click the keyframe there to enable the expression editor. And we're just going to type in wiggle, open parenthesis, 8 and 5. So the wiggle, that's basically the shake expression. And the first number, which is 8, that means how many times a second this is going to shake. So it's going to be 8 for us. And then 5 is the amount it's going to shake by. So if I click away, you will now see this X position value is red. And if I scrub through the timeline, you can see it is moving very slightly. So now the frame is shaking side to side. Let's do the same for the Y position, except this is going to be slightly greater. So wiggle, open parenthesis, 8, and this time I will set this to 10 and close parenthesis or bracket. Okay, so now if I just play the whole thing, let's quickly preview what this looks like, and I will go to, let's say, a quarter quality just so we can do this quickly. So the quality is very low here, but we can now see the shake effect. When the frame is moving though, we can see it leaves the edges of our total frame size. So we have to press S, go to the scale, and set this to be just a bit higher. If I go for 102.5, that's going to close up any gaps we see on the edge of our frame. Now, if you were shaking the frame by a larger value, this would also need to be larger in order to accommodate all of that shake that we are doing. Anyway, moving on, in the final piece, once again, we have these VHS lines going across. That is just some stock footage. I also want that to be affected by the RGB split, so I will dive in back to this level, which contains all of our layers. And this is the piece of stock footage we're going to use. And this particular clip cleans up at about 30 seconds. So that's going to be my in point. And once I have that, I can drag this to be in the project. And it just overlays on top. Let's press Ctrl Alt and F to full screen this automatically and set its blending mode to screen. Now the effect is a bit sparse, so I will copy this whole thing, press Ctrl and D, and trim it all the way to the end, and then bring this to the start. So I am overlaying this twice and doubling up on the amount of lines we have on the screen. And even then, there's still very few. But that's what I did for the original project, so I will leave it there. If I press the Tab key, I can go back to the main composition. Let's go back up another level to the very main one. And now we can see our VHS lines are part of the RGB split effect as well as the camera shake. So all that's left now are the final color adjustments. Let's go for an adjustment layer and blur and sharpen fast box blur. I will set the radius to 50. And let's repeat the edge pixels to get rid of the dark outline we currently have. So this is the difference with and without. And let's set this blending mode to screen, which is going to diffuse, glow everything. So let's drop the intensity on the opacity to about 30% and turning this on and off. That's the difference. Let's take another layer, go to stylize and glow, 100% for the threshold and the radius of, let's say, 400. So this is just going to make the brightest parts of the image just pop a bit more. And finally, let's go to Effect, Color Correction, and Lumetri Color. In the basic correction, I want to warm up the entire image. So the temperature I will set to about 30%. You could actually dial in any number you want. The higher you go, the warmer the tones are going to be. So maybe about 40. And in the creative section, I want to fade the colors. So let's change this from 0 to about 20 for this kind of final look. Another area of the color adjustments you could play with is in the curves section. This is past the creative. You've got curves. go down to these graphs here, and the hue versus hue one, you can use this to change the tone of the colors. So let's say the yellows here. If I go to where the yellow is in the spectrum, let's create a couple of points either side and then put a point in the middle. And I can move this up. And as I do this, you can see it's changing the tone of all of the yellows in my frame. So you could play with that. Let's say the purples, we could also do the same. Put a couple of points either side and then put the one in the middle to control those tones you want to target. So we want to make them a bit more blue, perhaps. We can do that very quickly. You could also try out the other graphs here. Let's say the hue versus saturation one. So instead of changing the tone, this time we're changing the saturation based on the hue. So let's say I want the yellows to be more saturated. I can do that here very quickly. And that's it. The Lumetri color effect we used at the end there is one of my favorite tools in this program, just because of how many different settings are within it and the various targeted adjustments you can make to the colors and tones. I think it's very useful. Anyway, in the following lesson, we'll do the final export from After Effects. Now that our project is finished, all that's left is the final export, and here are the best settings for that. Outputting the project from After Effects is very simple. We just go to Composition, Add to Render Queue, and in the Output module, I will select the QuickTime format. If that's missing, you may need to install QuickTime on your computer, and then go to the format options, and I just always use the animation preset. This is a very large file which is going to contain a lot of the color and bit depth information, which means that if we want to continue making changes and adjustments to the colors later in programs like Premiere Pro, we will have that information in the file. And the last thing here is to just output this to the correct location. And for me, that's the folder I've been working with for this project. So I'll call it main.mov, save, and then simply hit render. And here is a cool trick. If you press the caps lock key, it stops the preview whilst you're rendering and is going to output faster than if you leave this preview running at the same time. You also get an estimated time of completion, and for me that's going to be about 6 minutes, so not bad at all. And finally, in Premiere Pro, I want to show you my best render settings for both Instagram and YouTube. In Premiere Pro, I will double-click the import section to bring in our final render. We can double-click this to do a quick preview over here. Because it's such a large file, it may stutter when we play it back, but I know it's all there. Let's right-click and new sequence from clip. That's going to bring it into a new project we can edit. Let's select this, Control-C to copy, and then Control-V to paste. Line these two up, and just check that the looping is working. And it is. And let's say you are editing this with a song, you would just continue lining these up as many times as you need to fit the length of your music. Anyway, when you're ready to export, I'm just going to go to the end frame, press O to set the out point.